Have you ever met someone who changed your perspective on life in just one conversation? Check out this story. This is the story of a Christian journalist in his 30s, who for years wrote about the world with an objective lens, suddenly discovering something that shook his heart. It all began at a major event that brought together religious leaders and a simple conversation with a wise, elderly imam. What happens next will transform his life, his profession, and even the family he builds. From curiosity, he learns faith. From learning faith, he discovers love. And from that love, his life finds a new direction he never imagined before. Stay tuned, because this story is not just about religion or profession, it's about the journey of the heart, the search for truth, and decisions that change life forever. In a city that served as a meeting point of many civilizations, a major event was taking place, bringing together religious leaders, scholars, academics, and journalists from various faith backgrounds. The hall where the event was held was filled with serious faces, people who came with the intention to engage in dialogue, not debate. Among the attendees was a male journalist in his early 30s. He was known as a sharp, critical, and honest writer. From a young age, he had grown up in a devout Christian family, and his faith had always been an important part of his life, even though his profession required him to remain objective and open-minded. As a journalist, he did not come to seek sensation. He came with a notebook, curiosity, and a desire to understand how religious figures viewed an increasingly complex world. To him, religion was a source of values, but also often a source of conflict. He wanted to write about hope for peace. During one of the event's breaks, his gaze fell upon an elderly imam sitting calmly in a corner of the hall. His beard had turned white, his face was wrinkled, yet it radiated serenity. The imam was not surrounded by many people, but several participants approached him with deep respect. There was something about his demeanor that drew the journalist's attention, not because of striking charisma, but because of a calmness that was difficult to explain. Guided by his journalistic instinct, he approached and politely introduced himself. The conversation began with light topics about the event, the importance of interfaith dialogue, and the challenges of the modern world. The imam listened attentively, without interrupting and without haste. Every response he gave felt simple yet profound. The discussion gradually turned toward scripture. The journalist revealed that he had read some parts of the Quran, but only as a work reference, not as a text to be contemplated. He admitted that he often felt confused by how some people portrayed Islam, torn between teachings of peace and the reality of violence frequently reported in the media. The elderly imam neither defended nor attacked. He simply explained that the Quran is a book that invites people to think, reflect, and know their Lord through reason and the heart. He mentioned that the Quran repeatedly urges humans to observe nature, history, and themselves. According to him, violence is born from human beings, not from revelation. The conversation grew deeper. The imam explained the concept of Tawhid, the oneness of God who resembles none of his creation, who is most merciful and most just. He compared how the Quran speaks of the prophets as chosen human beings who conveyed moral messages, not as figures to be worshipped. The explanation was delivered without belittling other beliefs, as if merely opening a window so others could see from a different perspective. The journalist felt something unusual, not a feeling of pressure, but a sense of enlightenment. Many long-held questions he had kept about the nature of God, about sin and forgiveness, and about the purpose of life suddenly seemed to find direction. He realized that all this time he had often written about the faith of others, but rarely truly examined and reflected upon his own faith. After that day's event ended, their conversation did not stop. During breaks in the following days, they sat together again. The imam suggested that he read the Quran not to look for faults, but to understand its core message. He said that the Quran does not demand blind faith, but invites people to question and think. At night, in his hotel room, the journalist opened the translation of the Quran that he owned. He read slowly. He found verses that spoke of justice, compassion, personal responsibility, and hope. he was surprised to discover that many of the images he had previously held did not align with what he was reading. Day by day, his heart grew more restless, yet also more honest. He felt as though he was standing at a major crossroads in his life. As a Christian journalist, he knew that whatever step he chose would have significant consequences, not only for himself but also for his family and his surroundings. Yet he also felt that truth should not be rejected simply because of fear. After the major event ended, he did not immediately return to his old routine. There was a strong inner drive to continue searching, no longer as a journalist observing from the outside, but as a human being seeking to understand from within. He began visiting the mosque where the elderly imam usually spent his time. The mosque was not grand, but it always felt alive with the footsteps of people who came to worship and learn. Their first meeting at the mosque was simple. The imam welcomed him with the same smile he had worn when they first spoke. There was no lecturing, no demands. The imam merely invited him to sit and take in the atmosphere. He listened to the recitation of the sacred verses, read with measured clarity, and although he did not yet understand all of their meanings, he felt a sense of calm that had been difficult to find before. From that day on, he came often, sometimes in the morning, sometimes toward dusk. He learned about ablution, about prayer, about the meaning of every movement and recitation. The imam explained that worship is not merely ritual, but a training in humility and discipline of the soul. Every prostration is an acknowledgement that human beings have limitations and are in need of guidance. The lessons did not take place only inside the mosque. They often walked slowly through the courtyard, speaking about life, about moral responsibility, and about how faith should give rise to justice and compassion. The imam emphasized that Islam does not sever a person's connection to humanity, but rather deepens it. As a journalist, he was accustomed to asking questions, and the imam was never disturbed by critical inquiries. Questions about destiny, suffering, and differences in belief were all answered with patience. If there was something he did not yet understand, the imam did not force him to accept an answer, but instead invited him to reflect and to read. Gradually, he began memorizing short chapters. He learned to read the Quran haltingly, stumbling over the words. Every mistake was corrected gently. He felt like a child learning again from the beginning, yet without any sense of shame. It was precisely there that he found the sincerity he had long been seeking. Their relationship was not merely that of teacher and student, but more like a grandfather and grandchild united by a shared search for meaning. The imam often reminded him that knowledge without character becomes a burden, and faith without honesty loses its light. Those words took firm root in his mind. In his professional world, changes began to show. He wrote with a more balanced perspective, greater caution, and deeper humanity. He was no longer quick to draw conclusions based only on surface appearances. His colleagues noticed a new calmness within him, even though not all of them understood its source. There were difficult moments when he had to confront inner confusion and the shadow of possible rejection from those closest to him. At such times, he returned to the mosque, sitting quietly after prayer, listening to the imam speak about patience and steadfastness. He was taught that faith is not always an easy path, but it is a path that provides direction. Time passed, and his habit of coming to the mosque became an inseparable part of his life. He no longer felt like an outsider. He learned that Islam is not only about personal belief, but also about social responsibility, about guarding one's speech, about honesty in work, and about spreading goodness without seeking reward. The imam often said that each person's journey of faith is different. There is no need to rush, no need to compare oneself with others. What matters most is honesty with one's own heart and sincerity in seeking God's pleasure. In that shared companionship, the journalist realized that his journey was not over. In fact, it had only just begun. He was still a seeker, but now he was no longer walking alone. Under the guidance of the elderly imam within the simple mosque, he found a new foundation for his life, a foundation that allowed him to stand more firmly as a person of faith and responsibility. Over time, His desire to understand Islam was no longer limited to lessons at the mosque with the elderly imam. His journalistic instinct resurfaced, but now with a different purpose. He was no longer merely looking for material to write about. Instead, he wanted to understand how the teachings he was learning were lived out in the daily lives of their followers. At the imam's suggestion, he began conversing with many Muslims from diverse backgrounds. He started by interviewing members of the mosque congregation. There was a small trader who opened his stall every dawn after prayer, a laborer who maintained honesty despite living modestly, and a young man striving to distance himself from bad habits in order to better himself. From them, he learned that Islam is not taught only from the pulpit, but practiced through small, everyday decisions. He was also interested in hearing the stories of Muslim women. With respect and professionalism, he spoke with women who wore the hijab and came from varied backgrounds. There was a mother caring for her family while remaining active in social work, a university student striving to pursue her education, and a woman working in the healthcare field who viewed her profession as a form of worship. From these Muslim women, he heard how Islam gave them a sense of dignity and responsibility. They spoke of the hijab not as a burden, but as a conscious choice. They explained the role of women in Islam, which is often misunderstood, including the right to learn, to work, and to have a voice, as long as these are carried out with moral values and balance. Each interview left a deep impression on him. He realized that Islam does not appear in a single, uniform face, but in many expressions of goodness. He noted how the Quran became a source of strength for them in facing loss, injustice, and the challenges of life. He saw how prayer became a place of reliance when human logic reached its limits. He brought all of these stories back to the elderly imam. Together, they discussed what he had heard and felt. The imam emphasized that Islam is not learned only from books, but from people who sincerely strive to practice it. Perfection is not the goal. Rather, it is the earnest effort to continually improve oneself. Through this process, his faith grew more deeply rooted. He began to understand that embracing Islam was not the end of a search, but the beginning of a new responsibility. He learned to distinguish between teachings and human behavior, between divine values and the limitations of the community. This understanding made him more humble and more careful in his judgments. His writing changed as well. He wrote about Islam not as an issue, but as a human experience. He presented voices that were often overlooked, including the voices of Muslim women who had long been seen only from the outside. His writing did not provoke or judge, but invited readers to see more honestly. Within himself, he felt a growing and steady sense of peace. The restlessness that once haunted him was replaced by an awareness that life is a trust. He was still learning, still questioning, and still often making mistakes. But now he had a clear direction. His journey into Islam, shaped through encounters with many people, led him to understand one important truth. Faith is not merely a relationship between a human being and God, but also a relationship between human beings themselves. And through the stories of the Muslim men and women he met, he discovered that the Islam he was learning was not only a written doctrine, but a way of life lived with patience, courage, and hope. In the end, he made the decision with full awareness. After many nights of reflection, silent prayers, and long dialogues with his own conscience, he declared his faith in the one God and accepted Islam as his way of life. The moment took place simply in the mosque that had become the space where he learned and grew. There was no crowd, no media attention, only himself, the elderly imam, and a sense of calm that enveloped the sacred space. From that day on, his bond with the mosque grew stronger. He no longer came merely as a guest or a seeker, but as part of the congregation. He often met with the elderly imam, especially after prayers. Sometimes they discussed verses he had recently learned, sometimes the challenges he faced in life as a new Muslim, and sometimes they simply sat in silence, enjoying a togetherness that required no words. The elderly imam continued to guide him with the same patience. He was reminded that becoming a Muslim did not mean his life would suddenly become perfect. In fact, the challenges might feel even greater, especially as he continued his profession as a journalist. The world of journalism placed him amid differing viewpoints, conflicts, and competing interests. The imam emphasized that honesty, trustworthiness, and the courage to speak the truth were values fully aligned with Islam. He remained a journalist, but now with deeper awareness. He was more careful in choosing his words, more just in his assessments, and more sensitive to the impact of his writing on others. He did not hide his new identity, yet he did not turn it into a source of sensation either. For him, faith was a personal commitment reflected through attitude and integrity. In the newsroom, he encountered a range of reactions. Some were curious, some supportive, and others kept their distance. He accepted all of it with an open heart. He recalled the elderly imam's advice that human beings are not tasked with changing the hearts of others, but with safeguarding honesty within themselves. Whenever the burden felt heavy, he returned to the mosque. He found peace in prayer and strength in supplication. His regular meetings with the elderly imam reminded him that he was not walking alone. The imam often reminded him to remain humble and not to see himself as better than anyone else because of the change he had undergone. Gradually, he became known as a balanced and thoughtful journalist. His writings reflected empathy and cross-faith understanding. He did not lose his professionalism. Instead, it became even more firmly grounded in principle. He learned that being a Muslim did not distance him from the world, but guided him to engage with it with clearer values. In that mosque, between prostrations and prayers, and in warm conversations with the wise elderly imam, he realized that his life now had a strong center. He was a Muslim, a journalist, and a seeker of truth who continued to learn. His journey was not finished, but he had found direction, and that was enough to allow him to step forward with confidence into the days ahead. One afternoon, after congregational prayer and a light conversation on the mosque's veranda, the elderly imam invited him to visit his home. The invitation was simple, with no purpose other than fellowship. The journalist accepted it with respect. To him, the imam was not only a teacher but also a figure he trusted. The imam's house was not far from the mosque. The building was simple, surrounded by a small yard filled with plants. The atmosphere was peaceful, reflecting the character of its occupant. As he stepped inside, he felt a warmth unlike that of the newsroom or discussion hall. This was a family space where values were lived out daily. The elderly imam introduced him to his family with pride. Among them was a Muslim woman of about 25, the imam's daughter. She carried herself with calmness and courtesy, speaking gently. She welcomed the guest with good manners, maintaining proper boundaries while remaining friendly. During the visit, the conversation flowed naturally. They spoke about daily life, activities at the mosque, and the world of journalism. The young woman had a strong educational background and was active in social initiatives, particularly those related to education and community empowerment. The journalist listened attentively, noticing how Islamic values were reflected in her behavior and life choices. From time to time, the imam added explanations, as if to show that knowledge and ethics must go hand in hand. He emphasized the important role of women in society, not as mere complements, but as strong pillars. The journalist absorbed all of this in his heart, not as material for writing, but as a lesson in life. There was no excessive chatter. Everything was conducted with courtesy and mutual respect. Yet for the journalist, the visit enriched his understanding of Islam within the family context. He saw how the teachings he had learned at the mosque were expressed in the relationship between father and child, in speech, and in attitudes of mutual respect. Before he left, the elderly imam offered brief advice on the importance of choosing good company and keeping pure intentions in every step. The journalist nodded with deep respect. He returned home feeling calm, carrying a profound impression of a simple Muslim family, strong in their values. The visit did not change his profession, nor did it shake his principles as a journalist. Yet he felt he increasingly understood that Islam is not only about the individual, but also about a way of life built on manners, responsibility, and compassion. and the meeting at the elderly imam's home became an important part of his long journey as a Muslim, continuing to learn and grow. Several months after his first visit to the imam's home, the journalist began visiting more often. His relationship with the elderly imam remained warm, respectful, and based on mutual trust. The journalist felt comfortable around the family, especially with the imam's daughter, whose calm, wise, and humble demeanor impressed him. He came to know their daily life better, observing how the values he had learned at the mosque were practiced within the household and in family interactions. Over time, the seeds of admiration and respect grew into a conviction that she was the right person to share his life with. With guidance from the elderly imam and through long reflection, the journalist decided to propose. He prepared his intentions carefully, understanding that this decision was not only about love, but also about responsibility and seriousness in following the teachings of Islam. When he came to the imam's home to express his intentions, the atmosphere was warm yet solemn. He spoke honestly about his feelings and about the commitment he wanted to uphold as a husband and as a Muslim. The imam listened attentively, assessing the journalist's sincerity and seriousness, not merely through words, but through his actions, integrity, and faith demonstrated over time. After careful consideration, the imam accepted the proposal. He emphasized that marriage was not simply the union of two hearts, but also the union of values and responsibilities. He blessed their path with prayers, reminding them that patience, mutual respect, and commitment to faith were the foundational pillars of a happy household. The wedding preparations were simple yet meaningful. The journalist continued his profession, continued writing, and continued going into the field, but his heart now had a new purpose: building a family grounded in faith and moral character. Their wedding took place solemnly in the mosque that had witnessed his spiritual journey. Prayers, supplications, and guidance from the imams formed the core of the ceremony. After marriage, their life together was harmonious. The journalist remained active in his profession, but now he returned home not just as a worker, but as a husband. He saw how a household built on faith provided peace and strength. The imam's daughter accompanied him wisely, helping remind him of the values they had learned together and supporting him in every step. Whenever he faced challenges in the world of journalism, he recalled the elderly imam's advice, returned to prayer, and found tranquility in his warm family. The marriage was not only about love, but also about a continuously evolving journey of faith, about balancing worldly responsibilities with spiritual duties, and about a meaningful new life for both the journalist and his wife. Several years after their marriage, the journalist and his wife began building their family. The arrival of a child brought immense joy. The journalist, who had previously focused solely on his writing and fieldwork, now experienced the new role of fatherhood. He learned to guide his child with the values he had absorbed from the Quran, from the elderly imam, and from everyday life. His wife became a loving and wise companion, instilling good character and gratitude in their child from an early age. Every day, their home was filled with laughter, prayers, and simple lessons about life. The journalist felt how the responsibilities of being a father and head of the family helped him mature further. He continued working as a journalist, but now every journey and article he wrote was accompanied by reflection on the world he wished to leave for his child. He learned to balance his profession, family, and worship, finding an irreplaceable sense of fulfillment in daily life. Amid this happiness, the elderly imam began showing signs of frailty. He attended the mosque less frequently, and their meetings became shorter. The journalist regularly visited him at home, helping care for his health and accompanying him in warm conversations as before. Though his body aged, the imam's face continued to radiate calmness and wisdom. He often smiled when he saw the journalist and his family, as if witnessing the fruits of his guidance growing into real life. One day, the imam fell seriously ill. The journalist and the family stayed by his side with love and care. In the quiet moments, the elderly imam spoke softly, advising them on patience, responsibility, and the importance of maintaining faith. He emphasized that the journalist should continue guiding his family with honesty and kindness, ensuring that his child would grow into a person strong in faith and character. A few days later, the elderly imam passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by family and friends who loved him. The loss left a deep sorrow for the journalist and his family, but also a sense of gratitude for having received invaluable guidance over the years. He looked at his wife and child, realizing that the trust given by the imam was now in his hands, to carry forward the values, teachings, and example he had received. The funeral was simple, solemn, and full of prayers. The journalist stood beside his wife and child, remembering every conversation, every piece of advice, and every moment shared with the imam. He silently vowed to preserve that legacy not only in words, but in daily actions within his family, in his work, and in every step of his life. After that event, life continued. He remained a journalist, continuing to write and report news, but his heart now carried the depth and tranquility born from his journey of faith, family, and the imam's guidance. Their child grew surrounded by love, prayers, and example, while the journalist realized that even though the elderly imam was gone, his teachings and influence would live on in their lives. That's the inspiring journey of the journalist, from curiosity and meeting the elderly imam, to building a family and finding a new direction in life. A story about the search for truth, faith, and love that reminds us that every encounter can change our lives, even in the simplest ways. Remember, the story and images you see in this video are not real events. They were created purely for inspiration and learning. If you feel inspired by this story, don't forget to like and share this video with your friends, and click subscribe to follow more inspiring stories. Every click helps us bring new stories that can open hearts and minds for everyone.